Hello, everybody. I'm back. Welcome to Storytime with Chrissy Kortenhoeven. We are reading Amy Carmichael, and this is our second one, our second story. We're on chapter 3, A Voice from the Fountain. And if you remember from chapters 1 and 2, Amy was at the boarding school, and then they told her that she had to go home suddenly. She was at the Marlborough boarding school, and then her and her brothers, they were at a different school, but they had to go all the way back to London, and they had to come back immediately because they found out that their father had passed away, which this was in the 1800s, and this was very sad and hard work for them because then they had to go back and they had to help their mom out. So now we're going to hear what happens next. Okay, sit back, and let's get ready to read. It took a while for things to settle down, but slowly life around the Carmichael house fell into a new pattern. But one thing didn't change. Amy's parents had been strong Christians, and although Mr. Carmichael was now dead, each Sunday Mrs. Carmichael continued to take the children to the Rosemary Street Presbyterian Church. The family walked to church together dressed in their best clothes. On the walk home, Amy and her brothers, Norman and Ernest, liked to walk ahead of their mother and the other children. It was one of these walks home after church that something happened that completely changed Amy's life. It was a cold, dreary day, and Dr. Park, pastor of the Rosemary Street Presbyterian Church, had preached a particularly long sermon. After an hour and a half sitting in the drafty church, the whole Carmichael family was eager to get home to the warmth of the fire in the drawing room fireplace. As usual, Amy, Norman, and Ernest strode out in front. They were winding their way through the streets back to College Gardens when an old beggar woman came staggering out of a side alley. Her clothes were tattered and her feet were wrapped in strips of rags that were clogged with mud. Slung across her back in an old coal sack was a bundle of sticks. The old woman was doubled over under the weight of the heavy bundle. As the woman stumbled along, Amy and her two brothers stopped and looked at her. Despite their father's money woes, the Carmichael children had grown up with much more money than most people. Yet, they had also been taught to help others regardless of whether they were rich or poor. So with a shrug, the three of them walked up beside the old woman. Norman lifted the bundle of sticks from her back, while Amy and Ernest each took hold of one of the beggar woman's arms and walked along beside her. The old beggar woman smiled a toothless smile and pointed toward the alley about a half a mile farther down the street. The three Carmichael children had expected to help the old woman to a nearby building. The alley she pointed out was farther away than they intended to help her. Nonetheless, they would see her safely there. As they made their way along the street, Amy and Ernest, dressed in their best clothes, guided the old woman in tattered rags, while Norman, also in his Sunday best, followed along behind with a pile of sticks slung across the back of his topcoat. What they hadn't figured on was that at the pace the old woman was walking, other people on their way home from church would catch up with them. But that is exactly what began to happen. One by one, church members stared at the strange sight as they walked by. Amy felt her face getting hotter as each person from church passed them, especially when one woman hurried her children to the other side of the road to avoid the four of them altogether. Embarrassed, Amy and her brothers kept their heads down, not even looking at each other, and hoping no one important came along and saw them. There was a fountain in the center of the road. And trying to take her mind off walking along beside the beggar woman, Amy studied it closely. It was made of blocks of cut stone, and the water sprayed out from 3 sprouts. At its center, as she studied it, Amy suddenly stopped. Someone was talking to her. She clearly heard a voice say, "Gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw. The fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work which any man has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward." Amy turned to see who was speaking. There was no one there, but she had heard a voice, plain and clear. Puzzled, she walked on with the old woman on her arm. As she did, something felt very different inside. Amy was no longer embarrassed. In fact, she walked with her head held high for all to see. The trio escorted the old woman to where she wanted to go, and then ran to catch up to their mother and the other children to finish the walk home. After lunch, Amy went to her room. She knelt down by her bed. She knew the words she heard at the fountain were from the Bible, and finally she located them in her small leather-bound edition. These words were from 1 Corinthians, chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. Amy read them again. What was their meaning to her? Amy had known for as long as she could remember that God loved her, but she began to wonder about how knowing He loved her changed the way she acted each day. After several hours of praying and thinking, Amy finally decided she knew what the words from the verse meant to her. For one thing, she would no longer waste time on things that weren't important in God's eyes. When all the things she'd done in her life were finally judged by God, she wanted them to be found worthwhile. She wanted them to be seen as gold and silver, not hay and stubble. For another thing, she would never again worry about what people thought of her. If what she was doing was pleasing to God, that would be enough for her. If other people, even other Christians, didn't want to walk with beggars, that was their business. But Amy would walk with them, and she would walk proudly. When she finally came downstairs for dinner, Amy had a new purpose in her heart, a purpose that would lead to some very unusual changes in her life. Amy had always been kind. As a small girl, she had once visited Belfast with her mother. During the visit, they had stopped at a tea room for a cup of tea and some scones. As they ate, Amy noticed a grimy little beggar girl with her nose pressed up against the tea room window. The poor little girl with no food was looking in at the rich little girl who had a plate full. The gaze in the little girl's eyes had affected Amy deeply. When Amy got back home to Mill Isle, she sat down in front of her nursery fireplace and wrote a promise to the girl. "When I grow up and money have, I know what I will do. I'll build a great big lovely place for little girls like you." Amy was also kind to animals. She couldn't stand to see them suffer. Once, on her way to family prayer, she had noticed a mouse drowning in a bucket of water. Without a second thought, she scooped up the mouse and dropped him into her apron pocket. Unfortunately, the mouse had squeaked when her father was praying, and Amy was punished for disrupting the peace. But she had saved the mouse's life, so the punishment was worth it. But as kind as Amy has been in the past, there was something different about her now. She wasn't going to be kind just because that was the right thing to do. She was going to be kind because God had asked her to be the kind to those He loved. Amy's two younger sisters were amazed at the change in her. They called her new attitude Amy's enthusiasms. And Amy was enthusiastic. There was so much to do, so many people she knew God wanted her to love and be kind to. While Amy wanted to learn more about God, she also wanted to help others learn about Him. On Sunday afternoons, she would wander the streets of College Gardens and invite the local children back to the Carmichael house, where she would hold a children's meeting. The children would sing and clap, and Amy would read them Bible stories and tell them how God loved them. While Amy was busy with the children,